Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you new science fiction stories, a new world, a new adventure. And yes, there is no robotic or AI voices here, only real human voices with real human touch. So let's start this journey, and please subscribe my channel if you like the stories and press the bell icon for the latest updates. Let's have a story. Okay.
No weapons, no language, and just a 16-year-old who memorized everything. My name is Thessari. I'm Thessary 7 of the Copper Lattice Brood. If you want the full designation, but most non-Thessary find the complete form difficult to pronounce without accidentally requesting a mating evaluation. So we keep it short in mixed company. I'm a junior protocol observer. This sounds more important than it's my job. Sort of at Conclave Meridian, is to sit in the observation tier, record procedural violations, and file reports that senior observers use to pad their documentation metrics. I've been doing this for 2 standard cycles. In that time, I've filed 847 reports. Exactly 3 of pretty much them resulted in any action. The other 844 exist in an archive that I'm reasonably certain no living being has ever opened. I tell you this so you understand my expectations going into the emergency session of the Humanitarian Coordination Committee on the 14th day of the 3rd quarter. Honestly, my expectations were low. The session had been called because 3 systems in the Verath corridor were experiencing cascading infrastructure failures. Food processing, water reclamation, atmospheric stabilizers, all degrading simultaneously due to a supply chain collapse. That 3 different species had been arguing about responsibility for over the past 8 months. The people living in those systems weren't part of the argument. They were simply running out of things they needed to survive. The solution was straightforward. A coordinated aid package, pre-assembled, waiting in a distribution hub less than 4 transit days away. All it required was a committee vote authorizing the release. Simple majority, 11 delegates, 6 votes needed. I had attended enough of these sessions to know that straightforward solutions and actual outcomes rarely shared the same room. The delegate most, in my opinion, responsible for ensuring they didn't was already seated when I arrived. Vorak of the Keth delegation occupied the far end of the primary table like a weather system. The Kith were tall, gray-skinned, with facial structures that had evolved to express disapproval across 17 distinct gradations. Vorak had apparently mastered all 17 and rotated through them constantly, even when nothing was happening. He was the senior procedural representative for the Keth Consolidated Interest, which meant his official function was to ensure Keth concerns were properly represented in committee processes. His actual function in my 2 cycles of observation was to make sure nothing ever got done. He did this not through argument or obstruction in any obvious sense. Vorak was basically too intelligent for obvious obstruction. He used procedure, and the Conclave Meridian operated under the Meridian Compact, a governance document that had been amended, re-amended, sub-amended, and interpretively expanded over 230 years until it contained more words than most planetary constitutions. Vorak knew all of them. Every clause, every subclause, every footnote that referenced another footnote, that referenced a procedural standard established during a session so obscure it had only been attended by 4 delegates and a maintenance drone. He didn't block votes. He questioned their procedural validity. He filed challenges. He requested documentation. He cited precedents that required verification before proceedings could continue. By the time anything he targeted actually came to a vote, either the situation had changed, the delegates had exhausted their session allocation, or everyone had simply agreed to table it for next quarter. I settled into my observation position and opened my recording interface. Around the primary table, 11 delegates arranged themselves. The Verath corridor systems had sent representatives, 2 of them visibly tired in the way. The beings get tired when they've been trying to get someone to help them for a very long time. The other delegations, represented various interest blocks, each with their own calculations about what a yes or no vote meant for their respective positions. And then the human delegation entered. There were 3 of them. Lead diplomat was a man named Counselor Adiemi, broad-shouldered, unhurried, with the particular calm of someone who had attended many rooms like this one. Behind him came a translator, a young woman with a data pad already open, standard configuration for a human diplomatic unit, which the 3rd member I nearly missed. She came in last, slightly behind the translator, looking around the chamber with open curiosity the way young humans often did when encountering spaces designed for multi-species use. She was small, even by human standards, with close cropped hair and large eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything. She wore the gray and white trainee band on her left arm that indicated observer status. I think non voting, non speaking, present for educational purposes only. She looked approximately 16 years old. She also, within 30 seconds of entering the chamber, leaned toward Counselor Adyemi and said something that my audio pickup rendered as, "Are there snacks anywhere? I didn't eat on the transit." Adyemi's expression suggested this was not the first time this question had been asked. "This is a humanitarian emergency session, Nadia," he said quietly. "I know. I'm just asking about snacks, not about the session. Those are not separate things right now. They are completely separate things. One is look, a procedural vote, and one is a protein requirement. Unrelated categories." He produced something wrapped from his jacket pocket and passed it to her without looking. She accepted it with visible satisfaction and settled into the observer seat at the room's edge, unwrapping whatever it was with the careful quiet of someone who had done this before in places where noise was inadvisable. I recorded this exchange in my log under the category of miscellaneous human behavior, which had become one of my most populated documentation fields over the past cycle. Her name, I gathered, was Nadia Ose. The session opened with procedural confirmation, sort of plus delegates' verified credentials. The chair, a Melvari named Asavith, reviewed the session parameters: emergency humanitarian authorization, Verath corridor aid package, simple majority required. Vorak requested the floor before opening statements were complete. "Point of procedural order," he said, with the particular smoothness of someone who has said those four words so many times they've become reflexive. The well session documentation references supply authorization under Compact Article 7, Section 3. But the aid package in question involves atmospheric stabilizer components, which, under the Mechanical Infrastructure Addendum of 2.4, requires prior classification review before committee authorization is valid. Asavith paused, checked something, paused again. "The classification review timeline is 14 standard days minimum." Vorak said, "I've the procedural reference available if the chair requires it." He didn't wait to be asked. The reference appeared on the shared display. It was correct. I guess it was always correct. This was the thing about Vorak. He never cited anything incorrectly. He, I guess, simply cited things that nobody else had bothered to read. The room absorbed this. The Verath representatives exchanged a look. The kind of look that passes between people who have been in this room before and already know how it ends. In my observation tier, I noted the challenge, its basis, and its estimated impact on the session timeline. I had done this 43 times in the past 2 cycles, with various versions of the same outcome. I noticed peripherally that Nadia Ose had finished whatever she'd been eating and was now very still. Not bored still, alert still. She wasn't looking at her datapad. Plus, she was watching Vorak with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Actually, not concern, not confusion, calculation. It was probably nothing. Observers often watched attentively during their first sessions. The novelty wore off by the third one. In my experience, I returned to my documentation. Counselor Adeyemi responded to the classification challenge with measured language, requesting a brief recess to consult the relevant documentation. Asavith granted 15 minutes. Delegates dispersed into small conversations. The Verath representatives sat very still and didn't speak to each other. Nadia Ose walked to the refreshment station along the chamber's west wall, examined the options with genuine interest, selected 2 items, and returned to her seat. She offered 1 item to the translator, who declined. She shrugged and kept both when the session resumed. Adeyemi challenged the classification requirement on the basis that atmospheric stabilizers in this context were categorized as life support adjacent under Emergency Protocol 12, which suspended standard classification timelines during active humanitarian designation. It was a reasonable counter. Vorak acknowledged it, agreed it had merit, and then pivoted to a second challenge regarding the humanitarian designation itself, specifically whether the Verath corridor situation met the threshold criteria for emergency classification under the Compact's formal definition, which required documentation of active mortality events rather than projected ones. The room shifted. This was a harder challenge. The Verath data showed projections, models, timelines. Actual mortality events hadn't yet been recorded because the systems were degrading, not yet failed. The distinction was procedurally significant and also in any language that described reality, honestly, monstrous. But the Compact said what it said, and Asavith called another recess. The energy in the room had changed. 3 delegates were now consulting with their remote advisors. The Varath representatives were speaking to each other in low voices. One of them had their hands flat on the table in a posture I recognized as the physical expression of exhausted restraint. Nadia ate her second snack. I was close enough to hear her tell the translator very quietly, "He's going to go for the suspension clause next." The translator looked at her. Article 14, Nadia said, Section 8, subsection C, the rarely invoked one. If he can get the chair to acknowledge standing procedural ambiguity across 3 or more active challenges, he can request a 90-day deliberation suspension. Watch. The translator said nothing. Nadia had already returned her attention to the room. I looked at sort of my own records. I had been in this chamber for 2 cycles. I had documented Vorak's methods across dozens of sessions. I had never heard anyone predict his next move. You know, the recess ended. Plus, Adeyemi presented emergency designation documentation. It was thorough. Under normal circumstances, it would have been sufficient. Vorak acknowledged its thoroughness, agreed it addressed several of the prior concerns, and then requested the floor to note that across the current session, 3 separate procedural questions had been raised regarding the validity of the vote's foundational parameters. Under Article 14, Section 8, subsection C of the Meridian Compact, the presence of multiple unresolved foundational challenges constituted standing procedural ambiguity, which entitled any delegate to request a formal deliberation suspension pending comprehensive review. He requested the suspension plus 90 days. The chamber went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when everyone present has just understood that something has been lost and the formality of admitting it's still ahead of them. The Varath representative with their hands on the table closed their eyes. Osavith began the acknowledgement process, pulling up the relevant compact language to confirm the clause's applicability. Standard practice. It would actually confirm what everyone already knew, which Nadia OC raised her hand not urgently, which not dramatically. The way a student raises a hand when they know the answer and are being polite about it. Osavith looked up. The observer trainee does not have speaking. She may have speaking rights under challenge conditions, Nadia said, still with her hand up. Article 9, Section basically 2, subsection F, observer trainees granted provisional educational status may address procedural questions during active challenge proceedings if they've submitted a standing participation request to the session administrator prior to the session opening. I submitted mine at 0.3440 this morning, 42 minutes before the session was called to order. The confirmation is in the administrative record. Osavith stopped. Checked the administrative record. Vorak was very still. The submission is confirmed. Osavith said, with the tone of someone who has just discovered a room in their house they didn't know existed. Thank you, no you, Nadia said, and stood up, and she didn't have a data pad in her hand. She didn't have entities. She had finished her snack. She stood in the observer section with her hands loose at her sides and looked at Vorak with an expression that I was now certain I could categorize correctly. She had been waiting. The suspension clause cited by Delegate Vorak requires standing procedural ambiguity across a minimum of 3 unresolved foundational challenges, she said. Her voice was conversational, the voice of someone explaining something they found genuinely interesting. Delegate Vorak has filed 3 challenges. However, the emergency designation question was resolved during the second recess by documentation that met the formal threshold under Emergency Protocol 12, Clause 7. That challenge is resolved, not pending, which means there are 2 active challenges, not 3. The suspension clause threshold is not met. Vorak spoke. The emergency designation documentation hasn't been formally accepted into the session record. Until formally accepted, the challenge remains technically active. The formal acceptance window under the compact is 15 minutes from submission unless a delegate files a specific objection to the documentation's validity, not its sufficiency. Nadia said the window closed 11 minutes ago. No, to be fair, specific objection was filed. Formal acceptance is automatic under Article 6, Section 1. The documentation is in the record. The well challenge is resolved, silence, and also, she continued in the same easy tone, the classification review challenge filed first was also resolved. Delegate Adeyemi's counter-argument under Emergency Protocol 12 was acknowledged by Delegate Vorak himself as having merit. Under conclave deliberation standards, a delegate's acknowledgement of a counter-argument's merit constitutes de facto withdrawal of the original challenge unless the delegate explicitly refiles. Delegate Vorak didn't refile. That challenge is honestly also resolved. More silence, TBH, deeper silence, that leaves 1 active challenge. The suspension basically clause requires 3. The request that does not meet its own threshold Vorak's expression had moved past all 17 gradations of disapproval into a territory that appeared to require new gradations. "You are a trainee observer," he said. Plus, his voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "You have no standing to make procedural determinations. That authority belongs to the chair." "Absolutely." Nadia agreed. "I'm not making a determination, which I'm raising a procedural question for the chair's consideration." That's what Article 9, Section 2, subsection F permits. The chair makes the determination. She sat back down. Every eye in the chamber moved to Osavith. I realized I had stopped recording, not because I had forgotten, because I was watching too carefully to divide my attention. I made a note to recover the automated record later and returned to watching. Osavith reviewed the session record, plus it took 9 minutes. The chamber remained almost entirely still for those 9 minutes. Vorak consulted kind of quietly with his advisory staff. The Verath representatives had both lifted their hands from the table. The translator beside Nadia was looking at the girl with an expression I could only describe as reevaluation. Nadia was looking at the refreshment station. After review, I think Osavith said finally, "The chair finds the procedural analysis raised by the observer trainee to be substantively accurate." The first two challenges are resolved per the session record. Look, one active challenge remains. The suspension clause threshold is not met. Delegate Vorak's suspension request is not procedurally valid at this time, Vorak said. Very carefully, the chair's interpretation of the challenge resolution timeline is contestable under. Delegate Vorak is welcome to file a formal interpretation challenge, Osavith said, with the particular tone of a being who has found their footing. The filing window is 48 hours post. The session will proceed. The vote was called. It passed 8-3. The aid package authorization transmitted to the distribution hub within the hour. I know because I checked the outbound record, transit time to the Verath corridor. 3 days, 14 hours. First atmospheric stabilizer units on the ground within a week, 3 systems. Several million people and one procedural challenge filed at 0.34 cent in the morning by a 16-year-old who had also needed a snack. After the session closed, I remained in my observation tier longer than usual, completing my documentation. Below, delegates dispersed. Vorak left without speaking to anyone, which was itself a kind of statement. The Verath representatives stopped to exchange words with Councillor Adeyemi, the kind of exchange that doesn't require a translator because it's conducted entirely in the language of exhausted relief. Nadia was at the refreshment station. She had found something she considered acceptable and was reading something on a datapad that appeared to have nothing to do with the session just concluded. She looked, in this moment, entirely like a teenager occupying time. I descended from the observation tier. This was, to be fair, not standard procedure for a junior observer post-session. My job was, documentation, not conversation, which I documented this decision in my log as field observation extended and told myself it was for professional completeness. "You knew he would use the suspension clause," I said. Nadia looked up, which she didn't seem surprised to be addressed by a thesauri. Most beings were at least briefly startled by us, the carapace, the multi-jointed limbs, the pheromone undertone that most species couldn't consciously detect, but that produced a vague sense of organized watchfulness. She assessed me and found me apparently unthreatening. I honestly thought he probably would. She said it was the logical endpoint given how he was building the challenge sequence. He never goes for the obvious block first. He layers and creates the conditions for the bigger move. Once I saw the classification challenge, I could see where he was heading. You have attended previous sessions involving Delegate Vorak. No, this was my first time in a conclave session. I processed this. Then how I read the session transcripts, she said all of them. Well, I think all the ones involving the compact's procedural mechanisms. That's about 4,000 sessions over the past 60 years. Vorak was in maybe 300 of them. She paused. Also the full compact, obviously. All current amendments, the interpretive precedent record, the procedural advisory opinions. Some of those were actually really interesting. There was a boundary dispute in the 290s that had this incredible sequence where a delegate essentially argued that silence constituted consent, and it almost worked. She stopped herself. Sorry, the point is I read the pattern. He does the same thing. Every time, just with different clauses. The structure doesn't change. That archive, I said, is approximately 40,000 pages, 42,000 with the appendices. She considered this number with no particular emotion. I had 4 months before this assignment. I read fast. I stood with this information for a moment. "Why?" I asked, which she looked at me with the direct, slightly surprised expression that humans produced when asked a question they considered to have an obvious answer. "Because people needed help and someone was going to try to stop it," she said, and I wanted to be ready if I could do something about it. That seemed like a good enough reason to read some documents. 42,000 pages, 4 months, a 16-year-old alone somewhere, reading treaties and procedural opinions and interpretive precedents for 4 months, because she thought something like this might happen. And she wanted to be ready. The theory, approach to preparation, is collective. We distribute knowledge across a brood, which one individual carries what one individual needs to carry. The rest is shared, accessible, held in common. No single theory is expected to hold more than their designated portion of a knowledge structure. I had never before that moment considered this a limitation. Delegate Vorak has filed a formal complaint, I told her. The notification had come through my observer feed during our conversation. Challenging your standing to address the session. I know. He filed it 14 minutes ago. She didn't look up from her data pad. It'll be dismissed. Plus, the standing documentation is correct. I checked it against 6 different precedents before I filed it. A pause. I filed the standing request before I even knew for certain that he'd be in the session. I just thought it was better to have it and not need it. She had filed paperwork granting herself speaking rights as a precaution. In my opinion, before the session, before she knew what challenges Vorak would raise, before she knew she would need it, she had prepared for a possibility, not a certainty. The complaint would be dismissed. I already knew this looking at the documentation she had described. It was basically, as she said, correct, filed properly, in my opinion, supported by precedent, procedurally unassailable, by a 16-year-old who had done it at 0.340 in the morning as a precaution. Counselor Adyemi kind of appeared at Nadia's shoulder. He kind of looked at her data pad, then at her with an expression I was beginning to understand was his standard response to her, somewhere between pride and exhaustion. Good work in there? He said. The chair did the actual work. She said, I just asked a question. You asked the right question at the right time. That's what preparation is for. She scrolled something on her data pad. When's the next session? I saw a water reclamation dispute on the docket for next week that looks like it has some complications. Nadia, I'm just asking about the schedule. We are going to eat a real meal and sleep before you start on the next session. Those are not mutually exclusive with knowing the schedule. He produced another wrapped item from his jacket, placed it on the table beside her data pad, and walked away without explaining this action. She looked at it, looked at his retreating back, and appeared to find this entirely reasonable. I completed my field observation notes. Formally, I would submit them as extended session documentation. Category: procedural anomaly. In practice, they'd say that a junior trainee observer cited 14 interlocking treaty provisions from memory, dismantled a procedural obstruction that had defeated professional diplomats, and did so while eating something wrapped without notes. In her first conclave session, I left the chamber through the observer exit and walked the corridor back toward the documentation offices. Conclave meridian hummed around me. The machinery of interspecies governance, thousands of procedures and precedents and carefully maintained rules designed to ensure that meetings like today's could happen without dissolving into chaos or violence. All of that structure, all of those rules, and it had taken one human who had simply read them, all of them, every page, every footnote, every obscure precedent from 60 years of sessions to make them work the way they were supposed to. Not because she had outmaneuvered anyone, not because she had found a loophole or exploited a weakness, because she had prepared completely, quietly, invisibly, 4 months before anyone needed her to, because she had decided it was worth doing and then she had done it. The CAF delegate's complaint was dismissed the following morning. I know because I filed the observation report on the dismissal, which went into the archive that nobody reads. The aid, actually, package reached the Varath corridor in 3 days and 11 hours. I know because I checked. Plus, the formal complaint Vorak lodged against the procedural interpretation was reviewed by the Compact Standards Committee. It was dismissed 14 days later on the grounds that the trainee observer's analysis had been procedurally accurate at every point. The committee noted, in language that struck me as unusually pointed for a formal dismissal, that the session record showed a thorough and precise command of compact procedure that reflected well on the educational standards of observer trainee programs. Nadia Ose, I later learned, had attended the next session 6 days later. The water reclamation dispute, she had brought snacks, and the session had resolved in 4 hours, which was apparently a record for that particular docket category. Actually, Vorak hadn't been present. He had requested a temporary reassignment to a different committee track. I didn't file a report on this. Some things belong in the record, and some things are simply part of what happened. I thought about her sometimes in the cycles after that session. What she had done was not complicated in its method. Read everything, understand the structure, which show up prepared, file the paperwork in advance, which it was the kind of advice that any senior observer might give to a trainee. Self-evident, really, obvious, except actually that it required reading 42,000 pages as a precaution on your own time, before an assignment you weren't certain would require it. The thesauri concept for this kind of preparation does not translate cleanly into most other languages. It is a brood level activity for us distributed across many individuals. The idea that a single person would simply absorb that volume of knowledge alone in 4 months because they thought it might matter someday, we don't have a clean word for that, we should. The galaxy had been having meetings for a very long time, sessions and summits, TBH, and committees and councils. All those words, all those procedures, all those documents accumulating in archives that nobody read, and somewhere in sort of human space, a 16-year-old had looked at that archive and thought, I should probably read this, just in case. And then she had, not because she was commanded to, not because someone told her it was necessary, because preparation was a thing she had decided to take seriously, completely seriously, more seriously than anyone around her had anticipated or asked for. She had walked into that chamber unknown, unregistered in anyone's threat assessment, asking about snacks. She had walked out having dismantled the most effective procedural obstructionist I had ever observed, using only the tools that obstructionist himself had relied on. The rules read completely. Understood precisely, prepared for in advance, I headed back toward my documentation office, through corridors full of beings going about the ordinary business of running a civilization. Behind me, somewhere in the chamber section, I was almost certain Nadia Ose was already reading the next thing and probably asking someone about snacks.